Okay. So, hi everyone. My name is Sierra Johnson. I am a master's level clinical psychotherapist currently practicing through WHO Psychological Services. This workshop is on healing the inner child, which is something I am extremely passionate about. Aside from specializing in this, I also specialize in intergenerational trauma, psychospirituality, trauma just in general, but more specifically in childhood spaces. Okay. So I already mentioned that we're recording, so I don't have to worry about that piece. So here is kind of our itinerary for today. I'd like to note that all of these slides, all of these sections might have multiple slides. This is just kind of the breakdown of everything we'll be exploring. So, firstly, we'll be going over the origins of inner child work, just the history pieces in general. Then we're going to talk about how to identify your inner child or inner children, what they look like, how they may come up, pieces of that sort. The inner child and trauma, how they relate, what types of inner child wounds can come from a variety of different traumatic experiences. The inner parent, who that is, what that looks like, how the inner parent may come up. Inner child work in practice. And in practice, I mean in the therapeutic space predominantly, but also if you're doing your own inner healing work, what that may look like as well. Common difficulties with inner child work, what difficulties you might see with clients, what resistances might come up, things like that. And then I will have time at the end for additional questions and answers. Feel free to ask any questions you have during the workshop. That's not a problem. I just ask that you keep yourself muted throughout the workshop until you raise your hand and I call on you. There is a button at the bottom that says react. It should have like a little heart. If you click that, there's a button that says raise hand. And then I'll know, it'll alert me that you have your hands raised and I can lower your hand from there. Um, I'd also like to note that you can use the chat for that as well. If you don't want to use your voice, if you don't want to like verbally speak, there's also a button at the bottom that says chat. You can type in there. It'll alert me that something came up in the chat and I'll respond likely at the end of the slide. Okay. Does anyone have any questions about that before we get going? Okay, cool. Okay, so the origins of inner child work. So I like to start with Carl Jung because he's one of the first people we really hear talking about this concept. So inner child work kind of started with this divine child archetype that he mentioned quite a few times in a couple different areas. So the way Jung kind of explored it is that there's an inner childlike version of ourselves that follows us throughout life. So regardless of what you did as a child, it is following you moving forward. So I have three examples here of divine child archetypes that he mentions, and that's the abandoned child, the innocent child, and the dependent child. So the abandoned child, as it may sound, would be a child that was neglected, didn't have all of their needs met, especially basic needs, didn't feel nurtured, didn't feel supported by caregivers and other adults in their circumstances. So that version of yourself continues to exist in your thoughts and your patterns, behaviors, things of that sort. The innocent child doesn't necessarily mean a child that didn't get into stuff or didn't do anything, but it's the perception that came from the parents. So there's this idea of, oh, my child wouldn't get into trouble. My child doesn't do anything. Meanwhile, the child might have been. But now they're carrying forth this idea of, I don't get in trouble for stuff. Like, I'm not going to get in trouble. That's not something I need to be concerned about. And then the dependent child is a child that maybe didn't have a lot of access to independence, maybe wasn't able to explore a lot. So there was a lot of dependency on parents, caregivers, friends, whoever it may be, which can develop into an adult that also has a lot of dependence on other people, on the parents, still partners, whoever it may be at that point. After that, we kind of go into Vivian and Arthur Janov, who conceptualized in two books the inner child, the primal scream, and the feeling child. So the Primal Scream, I think, is pretty interesting. They had an institute called the Primal Institute. I don't know if that still exists. I kind of hope it does because I think it's a fascinating concept. But they have primal scream therapy. And primal scream therapy is this guttural, like, I'm screaming, I'm letting this emotion out. And their idea was, oh, if we do primal scream therapy, it can assist it with repressed childhood memories, which they believed was linked to neurosis. Now, neurosis isn't really a clinical term that we use anymore, but to kind of describe it, it's marked by like high levels of anxiety, high levels of distress, maybe varying uncomfortable or difficult behaviors and things of that sort. So primal scream therapy is something I've mentioned to clients before. I think it can be helpful because screaming can be an outlet for like anger or a lot of difficult repressed emotions that we don't often feel safe to express. The difficulty with screaming sometimes is finding a safe place to do that where we're not going to attract difficult attention or worry people or whatever it may be. And then the feeling child, this book was more from the perspective, I think, of the parents that were in the Primal Institute. So there's a lot of instances of, oh, I feel like I might have wounded my child from lack of attention or emotional validation. And these individuals are then considering, what do we do about this? And I think the important piece here is that lack of attention and emotional validation can very well be inner child wounds that exist moving forward. So lack of attention, I think, is pretty clear, like not giving the child the attention they need, maybe ignoring the child when they're requesting attention or asking for a need to be met. Whereas emotional validation, I think, in some instances can be a little bit trickier. Because what emotional validation is being able to say to a child that emotion is valid while also giving the support needed for that child to navigate that emotion. So, for example, just for the sake of this, oh, Holly. Oh, you're muted.
Oh, it didn't unmute. Sorry. Yeah, I'm
No
sorry.
problem.
I didn't want to make you stop
Oh, you're
mid-sentence.
fine.
Yeah, so the term the feeling child, is that just among the different inner child terms that Jung came up with?
The feeling child was
Or are these
just,
people like building off of that?
I think they were building off of the concept of inner child wounds in this book. So the feeling child was talking about different experiences that children can have based on the behavior or the impact of their parents.
Yeah, so how many archetypes did Carl Jung come up with?
Oh, that is a good question. I know it was more than 10. It was quite a few
Okay.
different ones. Yeah.
Okay. And then progressive psychologists just kind of built on those and came with their
Yeah.
own concepts. Okay, so
Yeah.
different terms. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So, emotional validation, I would say, is more so related to when we think about a child saying, like, I'm scared or I need help or I need something, we don't want to invalidate this fear by saying, oh, no, you have nothing to be afraid of. We want to say, oh, it's understandable that you're scared in this instance. So, the example I'm going to give is like, let's say a little kid, like 6 years old, says, I'm afraid there's monsters under my bed. And the parent instead says, oh, no, you don't have anything to worry about. There's nothing under there. Don't worry about it. And that's kind of the end of the situation. What a 6 year old would realistically need is, hey, I understand it's scary to think that there's monsters under your bed. Let me look. I don't see anything. I think we're okay. And that gives the child the accessibility to say, oh, look, my emotion was validated. And I know that I'm receiving support by my caregivers because they're expressing to me my needs being met and the emotion is okay. When we say things like, oh, no, don't feel that way, or you're not allowed to feel that way, it's not okay to feel that way, that's disregarding the emotional experience, which as you get older can create this sense of, I don't know what I'm allowed to feel. I don't know who I can express this feeling to. So I think as we think about inner child wounds, we also want to consider how various things that happen in childhood that might seem small in the moment could turn into a bigger wound later on. But we'll get more into that as we get into other slides. Okay, so Lucia, and I don't know how to pronounce her last name, I'll do the best I can, Capacchione, discussed reparenting in her workbook, Recovery of Your Inner Child from 1991. So in this book, it's very, very activity book centered. It's supposed to get you back into an inner child space, and you're supposed to explore the activities from a childhood perspective. So there's a lot of coloring, there's a lot of drawing, there's a lot of just things you would typically do as a child, but made for an adult audience. I think it's a really good book if you're wanting to see what inner child work is or to explore what inner child needs you might have. I think it's also a really good resource for clients that are doing this work in session, but maybe need access to homework to do outside of session. And then, kind of moving closer to the present, we have internal family systems therapy or IFS. I will admit I don't know a lot about IFS, but from what I do know about IFS, there is this concept of parts. It's often called parts work. And when you kind of compare IFS to inner child work, there's multiple inner parts, and some of them could be exiled. So exiles are parts of yourself that hold wounded or uncomfortable emotions. You push away from those parts of yourself, maybe to some degree to reject them. But when we think about it from an inner child perspective, there's that sense of you're still rejecting a part of yourself. I think that's also the case in IFS. And you want to make sure that there's a level of integration. You want to make sure that, yes, this part of you feels uncomfortable, but that is still you. Let's process some of these uncomfortable emotions. Let's see what these unpleasant memories are, and maybe either look at them from a new perspective, explore them in different ways, and then see if we can integrate those internal aspects. And then inner child work has definitely increased in popularity in recent years. I think with the rise of interest in spirituality, interest in healing trauma, interest in kind of exploring family systems and things of that sort, more people have shown an interest in wanting to explore those childhood pieces and see what's in there. And I also have noticed with a lot of people, it's associated with shadow work being this like deep internal, I want to kind of see what aspects of myself I've rejected and integrate them to the best of my capabilities. And when we think about concepts such as exiles, that is a big piece in that work as well. Any questions on this slide or anything I've mentioned so far? Okay. Okay, so next we're talking about identifying your inner child or inner children. So the inner child is younger versions of yourself, typically prior to the age of around 21. The reason why I say 21 is because for any of us that don't know, our prefrontal cortex is actually fully formed around age 25. So when we think about neurological or psychological maturity, that is where that's actually marked. It's not actually 18. So when we think about inner children, anything up to really 25 could be considered. But what I typically see with clients is around 21, that's where a lot of decision making changes, that's where a lot of new exploration tends to happen. So when I talk about the variety of ages a little bit later on, think 21 when I say early adult. But all of those versions of ourselves had specific or significant experiences that could or could not be traumatic. So you want to consider different events from your life and different traumas from around various life phases that may have impacted you. We'll talk more about that when we get to the inner child and trauma, like how those things can really come up. So some individuals can point to one specific inner child. When I say, like, think about yourself as a child, it's one version, and it could be really young or it could be a teenager. Those are the two I typically see. Others can sometimes say, oh no, I have multiple. There are multiple versions of my childhood experiences that really come up for me. And it makes it easier to explore right off the bat to say, okay, what are the different experiences then? As opposed to one inner child, okay, let's talk about what you experienced then. And then I might bring up, well, what about when you were a teenager? Or what about when you were a young adult? Or what about when you were a very young child? What experiences do you remember in that regard? So, like I mentioned, there's usually a young child, usually 7 and under, a child, 7 to about 10 or 11, a preteen, a teenager, and an early adult. And there's marked differences that can exist between them. So, for example, someone could say I was happy as a child, but I was bullied and shamed as a preteen and teenager. So, in that instance, we have two very different experiences that could create two very different perceptions of self. Another example being I was abandoned as a child, but still pretty hopeful. Like I was hoping my parents would step in. I was hoping my parents would give me what I needed. But as I became a teenager and I got older and I recognized social dynamics in different circumstances, now there's this sense of I'm angry, I want to push back, I want to rebel. Yes, Jamie?
From your experience working with people, does someone typically identify with one child more than another?
Yeah, so I actually talk about this on another slide, but that is definitely the case.
Okay.
Some people will identify more with like their inner teenager because there's a variety of experiences that happen at that time that are one easier to remember, but also there's a lot of social dynamics at that time. Some clients I've had will really identify with the youngest version of themselves because that might have been where they were happier, and that might have been where things felt more comfortable. So I would say often it's a teenager for a lot of people, but it really depends on that individual circumstances, experiences, where trauma may or may not have taken place, and things like that. Did you have any other questions on any of that?
Nope, I'll wait and see if you just answer it all later, like you mentioned.
No worries. So let me see. So the inner child is also parts of yourself that you felt the need to abandon or reject as you got older due to shame, discomfort, trauma, or finding behaviors inappropriate for your age. There's another example about this that I'll talk about a bit later, but think about the first time you were told, you shouldn't be doing that, that's childish. Or I can't believe you still do that, that's weird. Things like that can make you feel like, ooh, I have to kind of push away from that version of myself because it's not socially acceptable anymore, even though I still like it, even though this still resonates with me. And then the inner children also tend to have their own specific fixed emotional state, kind of like I referenced before. They might have their own wants and needs, and they might have their own internal perception of themselves and the people around them. So the inner child may want to fawn to neglectful parents, whereas the inner teenager wants to yell and rebel, as I mentioned before. For those that don't know, fawning is people pleasing. That's doing what you can to try to make other people like you, turning into other people for the sake of safety, just trying to keep other people happy because you feel like that'll make you feel more safe. Okay, any questions on this slide? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, I was considering the idea of, working with folks that have experienced pretty severe, sometimes complex trauma throughout childhood and adolescence. And so when we're asking folks to reconceptualize younger selves, I would imagine that there are individuals who are identifying some challenges in their ability.
Oh, Chris, you're frozen. I'll give him a minute, see if he comes back. Okay. Chris, I don't know if you can hear me, but if you come back in the next few minutes, I'll come back to you to get your question answered, okay? Okay, we're gonna move forward until he gets back. So the next slide is on the same exact piece of information. The inner child also tends to show up when the nervous system is activated or when we're in a, I can't see what's under this. Or let's just say when we're in an activated or overall overwhelmed state. So that could also be a trauma reaction, so to speak, too. Like when we think about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, that's when our nervous system tends to be activated, which can also bring out our inner children. So all of a sudden, these needs are being expressed, things are coming up that becomes uncomfortable, and this can be chronic or circumstantial. So our nervous system can just get activated here and there because of different stressors or triggers. Our nervous system being activated can also be chronic. Like when we think about the case of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, that is a chronic sense of being in a survival state. We're existing in that state constantly, and therefore we might notice more of our inner children kind of running the show, so to speak. We might have inner child wounds coming up on a consistent basis. So you want to notice behaviors that are similar to childhood experiences or versions of yourself when you're upset, defensive, or otherwise activated. Do you notice a level of regression? You start tantruming? Do you start kind of saying or communicating things in ways that you did when you were younger? Do old childhood beliefs or wounds start to resurface? Do you start to self-isolate? Do you start questioning your level of comfort with other people? Does mistrust or incidences from your teenage years where you're maybe getting bullied start to come up? Once you start to really look into these pieces, you might start to notice patterns. Okay, a lot of these things are starting to seem like when I was a teenager, or a lot of these things are starting to seem like when I was a young child. What might these patterns be trying to tell me? What need am I actually needing to get met in circumstances like this? Inner child wounds can also appear as things like self-sabotage, avoidance, or trauma reenactment. So I'll kind of break down all three. Self-sabotage is when we incidentally do something that goes against our actual goal. So for example, self-sabotage could be, I'm going to go back to the example of the child that had a happy childhood, but during their teenage years, they were bullied. So you might want to make friends. You might love people. You enjoy being around people. Your inner child really enjoys like community, contact with others. But your teenage self was bullied. So there's this sense of like not wanting to get hurt again, a little bit of not trusting other people. So you get close to people, you make that connection, your inner child's happy, and then your inner teenager pulls away. Your inner teenager is like, nope, this isn't safe. I'm getting red flags that may not actually be there. That's what self-sabotage can look like in a variety of circumstances. Avoidance is similar to self-sabotage in certain aspects, but avoidance would be when I am in certain circumstances or circumstances that remind me of my trauma, I'm going to just avoid it. I'm not going to go near it. I don't want to touch it. It feels too raw. It feels too vulnerable. I get activated in those moments, so I'm more likely to pull away. When we see instances of avoidance, what we really want to do is explore those instances and see, one, why am I avoiding it? And what narrative do I have around this experience that is creating that sense of activation? Processing the trauma around that can often lead to relief, but we want to see all of the levels of experience that are happening from our childhood experiences and that were reinforced moving forward that led to avoidance being the safest option. And then trauma reenactment. Trauma reenactment is something I find really interesting as a trauma therapist in general. But what it looks like is, let's say an individual had an absent father, for example, or absent parents in general. What can end up happening is your subconscious will incidentally seek out individuals that are similar to your experience with your parents to try to find closure, to try to heal that wound. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is we're reinforcing the wound because we might not have the ability to create closure in those moments. We might not even know we're doing, half the time we don't. With trauma reenactment, it's just a subconscious movement towards something. So inner child work can really help to navigate these three kind of circumstances that are likely to appear. And it gives you the opportunity to look at the pattern and say, what's actually happening? Am I doing what I want to be doing? Am I going towards my actual goals, or am I accidentally taking a step back because I didn't know these wounds were leading me in this direction? And like I was mentioning with Jamie's question, many individuals are closely connected to their inner teenager. So our teenage years, we have the most social awareness. We're in high school, we're dealing with like bullies and popularity, and does this person like me? Does this person not like me? What does this mean? I'm interested in this person. I find this person attractive. There's a lot of concern that can come in that too. More likelihood for concern about people's opinions about us, our appearance, all of these things. So you don't have to answer this question, but this is a question I'm just posing to the group. In what ways are you similar to or heavily opposing your teenage self? Because depending on your experiences during that time frame, you either might lean more into it because you were popular and you did get your needs met, or you could push away from it. I was bullied, harmed, people didn't like me. I'm going to reject that version of myself because that feels safer. And then opposition between inner children can also form in this way. So as I was talking about that self-sabotage piece, we could push towards something and then push away from it. That is opposition. So your inner teenager wants this, your inner child wants that, your inner adult wants something completely different. Now I don't know how to move. So for example, acceptance versus comfort. So let's say there's a teenage boy and he has always kept his stuffed animals. He's 15 years old, his bed's covered in stuffed animals. He kept the one he had from when he was a baby. He's never really had his friends over his house. One day he invites a friend over and his friend's like, why do you have stuffed animals? Like, you're 15, you shouldn't still have stuffed animals. And now there's this internal sense of, I didn't know that was weird. I like my stuffed animals, helps me sleep, I'm comfy, like I didn't know it was a big deal. But their friend is really making a big deal about it. So their friend leaves, they put all their stuffed animals in their closet, they're uncomfortable with it. They would prefer their stuffed animals to be there, but they also want to invite more friends over. So now there's this piece of, I want this, my inner child wants this, but my inner teenager wants to be accepted. My inner teenager doesn't want to be judged. So I'm going to pull away from an authentic aspect of myself to try to meet the social needs that other people may have or expect of me. So that's something to consider moving forward too. In what ways do we have to reject different versions of ourselves to get other people to be comfortable with who we are, who we wanted to be at that time? Any questions or thoughts on this slide at all? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the inner child and trauma, which I did touch on a bit in those last two slides, but we're going to dive a bit deeper into it. So childhood trauma can create multiple wounded inner children due to significant traumatic experiences or beliefs that could come up in a variety of life phases. So like I said before, the accepted and validated as a child individual, but they were bullied as a teenager, but then abused as a young adult. And the reason I bring up this experience is because sometimes our inner child wounds can lead us into situations that are more wounding later on. So if we are, let's say, self-sabotaging or we have trauma reenactment, we could end up in a situation where we're reinforcing past trauma with our current behavior. And that current behavior is informed by childhood wounds. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Individuals that were neglected, physically or sexually abused, or otherwise harmed may have behaviors or beliefs that appear in adulthood, but are very, very grounded in those childhood experiences of abuse. So one of my favorite books, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, talks about how our body holds on to all of those experiences if we haven't processed them, if we haven't released those emotions. So for those that don't know, our emotions store themselves in our body. If we do not process them, if we do not release them, they're just swimming around in our body. until they either get projected at someone or something else, which doesn't always release the emotion completely, or until they manifest as other things. So we want to consider that in our childhood, sometimes with repressed memories, we might not know what the trauma is, but we have emotional flashbacks or physical manifestations of these circumstances. But if you know as a practitioner that your client has childhood trauma, you might want to see, is any evidence of that showing up in their adult experiences? What childhood space might we need to explore to offer this client some relief? And if you're working on this for yourself, like I said, checking in with those patterns and seeing what's actually going on with this behavior. Is this behavior reflective of me now as an adult? Or is this behavior reflecting back on something that I maybe haven't sat with, maybe haven't processed, or maybe just wanted to bypass and ignore for the sake of safety and comfort? So one thing that's helpful is asking clients things like, what's your earliest memory of blank? This behavior, this thought, this feeling, this emotion, feeling this way in your body. Or when do you first remember feeling this way? Like we're talking about these emotions of fear. We're talking about these emotions of being overly concerned about social aspects. When do you first remember that coming up for you? It can help identify what age is holding on to that narrative, and then it gives you more access to explore what else was going on around that time. Trauma can also inhibit the inner parent, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, making them more silent, especially if parent-child relationships didn't feel consistent or safe. So our inner parent might not speak up. We might have a completely silent inner parent, and our inner children or intrusive thoughts are running the show at that point. In spirituality, the inner parent and the higher self are often seen as very similar, if not the same for some individuals. So the higher self is kind of this very calm, very non-judgmental version of ourselves that kind of guides us in one direction or the other. The inner parent does the same thing. The difficult part is intrusive thoughts block intuition. Intrusive thoughts also block the inner parent, block the higher self. So we want to create a balance there, offer relief from the anxiety piece so that you have more access to intuition later on. Any questions on anything I mentioned here? Okay. Okay, so the inner parent. The inner parent is the version of us typically based either around how we were parented or exactly opposite from how we were parented. So it really depends on our relationship with our parents and our trust of what information or narratives our parents gave us. So it acts as an internal navigator. So I'm going to use the id, ego, and superego as examples. I'll describe each for anyone that doesn't know what those concepts are. But in psychoanalytic psychology, I think this was actually specifically coined by Freud, but we have the id, ego, and superego as navigators. So the id is most similar to the inner child. I need this now. I want this now. Give me this now. I have this specific urge, desire that I want to fulfill. So I'm just going to go do it. The ego is kind of us in the middle trying to navigate between the id and superego. And the superego is the sense that says, wait, hold on. We have to do what's morally right. We have to follow the rules. We have to go based on what society wants. And we're trying to balance that out. So the superego is most similar to our inner parent, trying to navigate, trying to do what's right, trying to do what makes the most sense. As we develop our inner parent in healthier ways, sometimes that superego-esque version of ourselves might interact with things a bit differently, but it's very much based in what childhood experiences we had growing up when we think about it from the inner parent perspective specifically. Depending on trauma, parenting experiences, and our perception of authority, the inner parent can take a variety of forms. So I have 3 examples here. There's silent and absent, which I mentioned before, doesn't say anything, or it's a whisper. It's like a quiet voice that you don't really hear. And if you do hear it, those intrusive thoughts come in and get in the way anyway. You're not able to even stay grounded in that. There's the criticizing inner parent, the inner parent that's like, no, don't do that. You can't do that. Why are you doing everything wrong? You're so stupid. Like when we think about individuals that constantly insult themselves to try to motivate themselves, that is a criticizing inner parental voice. And I'd like to note, just for the sake of talking about this one here, criticism, I think, was originally seen as a motivator, but we've realized in time and through looking into mental health that criticism can actually delay motivation, can pull us back, can make it harder for us to achieve certain things. So we want to be mindful about what that inner voice sounds like in a lot of the situations that we are utilizing that voice in. And then the strict or rigid inner parent. So this typically looks like, okay, I am wanting to explore something, or I'm wanting to do something, or I'm wanting to move in this direction. And and the inner parent is like, no, you can't do that. That's not safe. You can't explore that. You can't go have fun. And it likely is due to circumstances where you either had a lot of passivity as your childhood experience, you were allowed to do too much and you got hurt, or you had a strict parent who kind of kept you in a very specific, I'll use the word box, like you couldn't really navigate outside of the specific space. There are other inner parent voices, but these are the ones I see the most with the clients that I work with. So the goal of inner child work, when we think about the inner parent, is to have healed inner children and a healthy, consistent, non-judgmental inner parent to ease in navigation. So you want to work on the inner children, make everything consistent, create a level of integration, heal that childhood trauma, while also working on your internal voice. How are we talking to ourselves? How are we showing up for ourselves? What things are we doing to make sure that we are not reinforcing those childhood wounds? And how are we creating a healthy parental sense of self in ourselves now? The reparenting process, which I'm going to talk more about in another slide, helps to heal the inner children and create that healthier internal parental figure. Any questions on this slide? Okay. Chris, I see you're back and you had a question from before. Did you want to finish asking it?
Yeah, I did. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
I got wonky. Yeah, I was just reflecting on a few slides ago, and this concept of building a narrative and helping clients to better understand childhood and adolescence. When I was reflecting on some of the folks that I see, I think about the complexities involved in reviewing highly traumatized, sometimes disassociative states. And so I was thinking, like, this sounds fantastic. And I imagine an obstacle for some folks working with people with complex trauma is the recall. You know, Sierra, I don't remember a lot of my childhood. It was bad, though. And so it maybe causes some challenges in developing some language around that. And I wondered, and as you continue to talk, maybe it is helping to identify elements throughout therapy that might come back to what we consider a childlike state or an adolescent state, or, you know, how are these responses or thoughts immature? And we can use that rather than having clients almost build a childhood narrative.
For sure. Yeah, I agree. I actually talk about that a bit in the common difficulty section. But not only does having a difficulty with your childhood self cause already this narrative, this resistance, I don't really want to dig into that, that feels uncomfortable. But then when we have repressed memories at that, or we don't remember our childhood, or we don't have a positive space to link back to, exploring this feels really tricky. And that's when I often either kind of hit the brakes a little bit. Let's talk about some of these narratives, these feelings. Let's explore what's coming up as we're talking about this. But I'll also go into, let's talk about reparenting. Let's talk about what you needed from an adult, what circumstances weren't met, and how you can meet these spaces now. So maybe you feel more comfortable exploring some of these concepts. But we'll get into that too. But I appreciate your question, because I do think we don't talk enough about how different types of trauma can bring up different responses to a variety of modalities at the end of the day. Okay. So the inner child in practice, what it looks like doing this work for yourself as an individual, but especially with clients. So the first step for me is making sure the client is prepared and ready to do this type of work. I do this with any type of trauma work I do, because trauma work can be intensive, uncomfortable, doesn't always feel good. It usually really doesn't, as we're digging into like the nitty-grittiness of it. So make sure you have healthy rapport with your client. You want to make sure your client feels comfortable being vulnerable with you, feels comfortable saying, I can't keep talking about this right now. I need a break. A lot's coming up. If you don't have good rapport with the client is less likely to feel safe diving into some of these things, especially if it's more raw, feels more vulnerable. You also want to make sure that your client has access to process outside of session. In my opinion, I think inner child work should be consistent. Once a week for 55 minutes isn't necessarily going to do the work the same way that you have session once a week, but you're also journaling. You're also looking into your patterns. You're also doing some extra work or homework that I'm giving you too. So you want to make sure all three of these things are kind of met before you start diving in. I've started inner child work with a client that said they were going to do homework. They didn't do the homework, and then they'd ask, well, I'm noticing nothing's changing with this. I'm like, well, we're not necessarily bringing this out of session 2. You want to make sure all of that stuff is being explored so we have a consistent pattern. And then in our next session, we can explore, what did you realize throughout the week? You had this homework assignment, or you were going to look into your patterns. What sorts of stuff came up? Clients that benefit most from inner child work are those already aware of childhood trauma. They have an internal negative critic or self-concept. Clients with a spiritual background, like I said, they're more likely to bring this kind of work up, or clients that often reference childhood narratives. So if you have clients that are consistently bringing up a childhood story, consistently bringing up circumstances from their childhood that are like coming up for them in their mind, or they're consistently thinking about or ruminating on, these clients likely will not necessarily feel most comfortable with this work, but I think this work applies more to their circumstances that they're coming in with. And then here are some modalities. Oh, go ahead, Holly.
Can you clarify what you mean by clients with a spiritual background? Do you mean clients who are currently religious or spiritual, or their childhood had like a certain specific religious upbringing?
Yeah, for sure. So spirituality, in the way that I reference it, usually speaks more to, how do I word this? I'll give you a cluster of spiritual practices. So like paganism, neo-spirituality, some people just loosely call themselves spiritual as an overarching term, and that usually relates more to the mind-body-spirit connection. So you might hear them talk about chakra work. You might hear them talk a lot more about meditation. You might hear them talk about utilizing different forms of mindfulness or things of that nature as part of their process. They might do deity worship, things of that sort. But spirituality in that term usually relates to that subset of people.
Yeah, and for me, I wasn't so much concerned about the spiritual part, but the background part. Is
okay.
it more about their childhood experience, or that they're currently spiritual?
It's usually current. I haven't had too many clients say the past specifically. Some clients will come in with religious backgrounds and they now identify as spiritual, but it usually is a current, I identify as spiritual, this is what my practices look like, and things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so here's some modalities I think can be really helpful with inner child work. Somatic experiencing is one. I love somatic experiencing. I think it's really helpful because a lot of emotions are likely to come up. So somatic experiencing is really deep emotion work, physiological experiences of emotion, kind of sitting with how the emotions feel in the body, considering where emotions sit, where they come from, and how it feels to sit with that emotion in general. Because a lot of emotions, when we repress them, when they come up, they might feel like anxiety. They might feel more intense than we remembered. Or when we think about that piece I mentioned about emotional invalidation, we might not know what that feeling is. We might not know if it's safe to feel that emotion. So I think somatic experiencing can give the emotion a space and give us a chance in a safe way to explore, okay, what's coming up? What is this? Let me sit with this with a trained professional that can utilize this space to help me understand what's going on. Shadow work, as I mentioned before, which is, like I said, deep integrative work, taking all of the pieces of yourself that feel like you needed to push away from them, they didn't feel safe, and identifying, processing, understanding what trauma related to that behavior, what trauma reaction that actually is, and then integrating that back into the self. Mindfulness, which is kind of sitting in the present moment, wanting to be kind of consistent with where you are now, trying to avoid things like rumination or thinking too much about the future, sitting with where you are and feeling into where you are. And I'm going to kind of merge meditation and visualization together because I kind of use them within the same way. But meditation is more kind of that deep, quiet, not necessarily quiet. Sometimes we have music or guided meditation, but your eyes are closed, your eyes are lowered, and you're visualizing something or sitting with something. And it could just be a feeling. It could be that you're sitting with an empty mind. Sometimes that's the goal of meditation for certain individuals. But when I use meditation with inner child work, we're meditating on inner child themes, specific emotions, specific wounds, and we're utilizing that space to consider what comes up when I consider this. Now that I'm offering space for it, what might come up to the surface? Visualization, I kind of use in the same way, but I use the visualization a lot for reparenting or utilizing the inner parent. Visualize this adult helping you in this situation. Visualize what you needed to happen in this moment. What would it have felt like or looked like if an adult or you as an adult had been present there to help you or assist? I think all of these are very helpful. I think there's some others, like EMDR could be helpful too, because EMDR could help you dive deeper into that childhood wound. And I have a client that uses EMDR and sees me for inner child work therapy. The EMDR is to dive into the inner child wound. They come to me to explore it, talk through it, and see what came up. So, any other thoughts or questions on this slide? Okay. Okay, so there's more. So this is what happens after you create those like initial connections with your client. And these steps aren't in a particular order. I think any of these can happen at any time depending on what the client's bringing up. So first, you want to find the source. You want to say, when did this experience, thought, narrative, belief, whatever it may be, start? What did this make you think as a child? Did you feel this way before XYZ circumstance happened? Did you feel this way before you were bullied? Did you feel this way before you were dealing with neglect or abuse? How have you felt since then? So we want to look at the before and the after. What pattern or ripple effect has this created? And how were you before this moment? What experiences, thoughts, beliefs, or perceptions did you have before this specific instance happened? And then you want to validate childhood experiences. I think this is very important because I think there's a lot of narratives that go around about what a good child is, a bad child, like you were a bad child at this age. Like, what do those things actually mean? So here are some phrases that I've often used in this regard. That behavior was normal for your age, for one. So let's say someone was a young child and they were excited to go to Kmart, for example. And when they were going, they were being really giggly. They were really happy. And their parents said, no, you got to be quiet. But the way they said it came off maybe a little bit harsh. And now there's this internal sense of, well, I'm happy. I don't know how else to express this emotion. So I don't know if this was wrong or not. There can be confusions around instances like that, especially if they're on repeat, especially if you're constantly being shushed for being excited, or parents are expecting you to behave in a specific way that maybe you don't have the maturity for at that time. So I like to validate for people that that behavior was normal. Other people may have had a different reaction to it based on their perspective. I also like to say things like children tend to act that way. That is normal for children to do, especially if there's a narrative around like, oh, well, I was being too childish. Well, at 5, like that behavior kind of makes sense. Like I think a lot of 5-year-olds tend to do things like that. So normalization. And then it's unlikely you would have known differently at that age. So an example here would be something like, let's say a 7-year-old touched the stove, or let's go younger, 4-year-old touched the stove, burned their hand. Their parent reacted by getting upset with them. Why did you touch the stove? You knew it was hot. 4-year-old you didn't actually really have a conceptualization for what hot was. Didn't really know the stove was hot. Didn't even know the stove was on. And there's this wound because now you're in pain, you were yelled at, and you're internalizing the sense of, oh, I should have known this thing I didn't know. What else should I know that I didn't know? And if there's a lot of instances of that, if there's a lot of instances of being yelled at for things and being told you should have known when you didn't, well, now there's a sense of walking on eggshells, uncertainty about your perception, what's safe to do or not do. And that can lead into a variety of other wounds later on. And then lastly, it's unfortunate that you were taught that being a child was wrong. This is kind of an overarching term. I think when we experience individuals that have negative conceptualizations around childhood in general, it often comes from spaces of being consistently wounded or harmed or told certain things about their childhood experiences that were difficult. And I like to use these overarching statements because sometimes it gets to the point where it's like, hey, it sounds like you were led to believe that being a child was incorrect, or that you had to be more mature than you were ready to be at the end of the day. And then reconnecting to positive childhood experiences. I spoke to this a bit when I was talking to Chris, but sometimes there are not childhood experiences. So I want to preface there. There might not be a positive experience that a person can link back to. It's good if they do. It's not bad if they don't, I'd like to note. We can skip per se to the reparenting piece, the visualization piece. What did you need an adult to do? What would it have been like if an adult had been there to help you, keep you feeling secure and things like that? But to touch on what you can do if there are positive childhood experiences, you want to say, okay, I know you were happy in the story you told me about going to Disney World, or I know you were happy in the story you told me about going to the zoo. What did that feel like? What was different about that day as opposed to some of the more traumatic experiences that you had? And you want to, one, compare and contrast, but two, also utilize that as a means to say, this might have been a more authentic version of you because you weren't having to people please, you weren't having to walk on eggshells, you weren't having to do all these other things that took away from your ability to authentically express yourself at the end of the day. And then utilizing things like old childhood pictures or items to reconnect. I'm going to go back to the example of the teenage boy that had to put all of his stuffed animals in the closet. If he was a client, he might want to pull one of two of those out and we can talk about what did it mean for you to have to put these away? And what did these childhood stuffed animals mean to you when you were a child? What level of security or safety was associated with these items? Here's some other questions I think might be helpful. What do you see in this picture? Just a blanket. What comes up when you look at this? Also, third person questions. How does that girl in this picture feel? Trying to take the client out of the circumstance and ask, what do you think this person is feeling? What do you think happened before and after? I have a client that has difficulties with remembering childhood experiences. We utilize that example, and the client was actually able to remember what happened before that picture was taken by making it third person, which was not necessarily expected, but it was really awesome to have that come up because it made it easier to explore. Well, wait a second. I was really upset before this happened. My mom did this or this happened, and now we have more narratives and emotions to explore. And then what emotions does looking at this bring up for you? There's a variety of ways you can utilize that, but like I said, you never know what might come up, and it always gives you an opportunity to explore or gain more information and see what the client is holding on to from specific instances, narratives, etc. And then emotional reconnection. So emotionally reconnecting with those inner child wounds or spaces. That work can feel a little bit icky because you're going back into spaces where there are emotions you likely suppressed or repressed. Somatic experiencing can be helpful in that regard because, like I said, it offers a space, it feels safer, and you're able to explore what it means to have these feelings and what those feelings meant then and now. So, for example, how do you feel when you're talking about this? What did you feel at that time? What did you do with what you were feeling? So if you were feeling angry at that time, what did you do with that anger? Did you express it? Did you tell anyone you were angry, or did you suppress it and sit on it because it wasn't safe to be angry in that moment? Where does the feeling still live in your body now? I really enjoy this question because it really digs into not only somatic experiencing, but as like some clients will bring up chakra work, and it can be helpful to say like the feeling sits in my chest, it's in my heart, the feelings in my throat, I feel like I couldn't speak up. And now there's even more narratives and things we can piece apart and explore because there's an attachment there. I was angry, I had to suppress it, and now I don't speak up when circumstances happen. I don't set those boundaries because I don't want to bring up something that might affect other people. It can also be helpful, as I mentioned before, to remind clients that our emotions stay in our body. They still exist in there. So yes, you suppress that emotion at that time. That emotion's still there. Let's find a means to give yourself some relief and get that emotion moving and out, and things of that sort. Any questions on any of that? Okay. One sec, my mouse is stuck. There we go. Okay. So we also have more inner child work in practice. So I spoke on visualization and meditation. This is kind of retouching on what I mentioned before, visualizing an adult helping you in some of these circumstances or instances. When you think of yourself as a child, how old are you? That's something really helpful to meditate on or visualize. And then we talk about what were you wearing? What are you doing? Are you happy or sad, upset? What experience are you actively in? Sometimes it's just me standing there as a child, and that's fine too. What would you be doing? At that age, in that outfit, what might you have been doing on a typical day? I love this one. Visualize doing things you enjoy with your inner child. So this one can be tricky. Some people have a hard time with visualization. That's okay. But let's say you're baking something. Just in your mind's eye, your inner child is baking that with you. 5-year-old you is helping you stir the batter. 5-year-old you is helping you put sprinkles on top of the cake. 5-year-old you wanted you to put sprinkles on top of the cake. So we're just going to dash a little bit on just for that sense of inner child connection. Let's say you had a messy room growing up. You can clean your room with your inner child. You might not want to clean your room now, and that's okay too, but it might be that added motivation. Hey, let's use this as a therapy homework right now. I know you're trying to clean your room. How about you visualize your inner child doing it too, so you get that satisfaction of having a clean space again, which you might have needed an adult to help you do at that time. And then ask your inner child what they may need in meditation. Your inner child may not answer. That's okay. But you want to open that space up, asking those questions such as, what do you need? What did you need? What's coming up for you? I've noticed with a few different instances, the first few times you do this, you might not receive anything. If you like to meditate or you meditate a lot over time, sometimes there are answers. And that answer might be a feeling just in your body. That answer also could be a word or a sense of something. It could be your stomach growling at the end of the day too, but we can also think about what are needs that weren't met and how might they manifest in ways that are a bit more wordless. And I've talked about this quite a bit, but viewing intrusive thoughts as younger versions of yourself, asking for a need to be met or expressing a fear that was never worked on or considered. So sometimes I'll ask clients when they reference intrusive thoughts to me, I'll start by asking, do you think this might relate back to a certain time period of your life? And then I'll ask, what did you need at that time? What did people do instead? What did you actually experience? So let's talk about how we can get that need met. And like I mentioned, sometimes those intrusive thoughts can be fears. So not the greatest example, but when we think back to that child that was afraid of monsters being under the bed, that fear could be a lack of safety. There could be this internal narrative that says, I'm unsafe, something bad's going to happen, I don't know what to do. That inner child is asking for a need to be met, which is safety, security, and consistency. And if we don't have adults that can build that for us, we then work on building that within ourselves through the reparenting process. And reparenting really looks like identifying what you needed in an adult at that time, and asking yourself, how can you do this for you now? I'd like to note with reparenting too, you don't have to make yourself the parent. You can visualize some other adult or some other thing. I've had clients visualize just these glowing circular things, and this thing is communicating with me. It doesn't have to be you, especially if that feels uncomfortable. But you still want to have some other presence that feels like a supportive caretaker, nurturer, or someone that can step in for your inner child when we work through some of these visualization processes. So like I mentioned, visualizing an adult version of yourself stepping in. You were being bullied as a kid in school and none of the teachers did anything. What would a helpful adult have done in that instance? What would you have needed somebody to do? You were dealing with heartbreak. What would you need an adult to do to help you in that situation to feel secure and understood? And then lastly, with reparenting, letters to your inner child from an adult perspective. Those letters can be really about anything. It could be an apology. It can be relating back to old experiences. And it can also just be giving that reassurance. Hey, I know this stuff was hard. Here's where we are now. Just for your reference point, we've made it this far. We've overcome this situation, this situation, this situation. Just so you know, we've made it to this goal that we might have had at like 15. Yes, Jamie?
How often do you answer these questions for clients? I think some of these would be pretty difficult for people to answer. So do you just continue to probe them with different questions until they come to an answer by themselves? Or in the beginning, are you helping them answer this in some way?
It depends on the client. So a lot of times when I ask a certain question that I really can't answer for them, I'll usually just say it's okay that you don't know right now. And we might talk about it from a different lens. And we might talk about why the client doesn't know the answer to that question. Or we'll start talking about what did that question bring up for you? Especially if I'm noticing a sense of discomfort around the question or a level of hesitation, we might talk about the experience or the feelings of that piece instead. If a client is someone I've been working with for a while, when I say I'll answer the question, it's more, hey, I remember you mentioned this to me before. I wonder if this relates to this question. So it's kind of more prompting than me saying, oh, I think what you're looking for is this. It's instead, hey, this happened before. Let's see if this correlates in any way. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions or considerations about this slide? Okay. Okay, so here's common difficulties. So some people have rejected or detached from their inner child due to certain experiences, as we've talked about throughout this entire experience, and therefore may have resistance when doing inner child work. So I always recommend working with that resistance first. So we don't want to push through, like that's not really trauma-informed care. We want to make sure we're actually considering, okay, what's actually coming up when we talk about this type of work? What narratives do you have around being a child? Does it feel safe to talk about these spaces? Are you worried about judgment? Is there anything about your childhood that feels maybe a little bit more uncomfortable to dive into? Let's talk about all of that first, and then we'll see if you feel more comfortable later on. If not, we can talk about other things and see if there might be a level of relation or correlation there. But I think that also goes back to what I mentioned when it comes to inner child work and practice. Make sure that your client is prepared for this work before you dive into it. Resistance is a sign they might not be fully ready for that yet. And then memory loss due to trauma. It can change the way the process moves, of course, but you can still work with memories that the client does have. You don't have to rush into anything specific, especially if the client's not remembering certain things. Like I mentioned in a couple slides ago, work on the reparenting piece first. And inner child work has been shown to bring up repressed memories. As we're diving into things, as we're exploring different topics, now I'm remembering this. Or we just explored this traumatic experience. Now I remember this other one. Or I'm remembering what happened before or after this moment. So it takes time. Like I said, the process might be a little bit different, but I think the work can still, of course, be done. And then trauma reactions or emotional flashbacks in session. I don't believe this is a difficulty, just from my perspective. I think it gives you the opportunity to explore what emotions are grounded in these spaces, what emotions are stored in the body, and a trauma reaction gives you the opportunity to point out a potential pattern or a way that a client showed up in a specific moment or under a specific topic. So then you have the opportunity to say, hey, I noticed that when we were talking about this, you reacted or responded in this way. Let's talk about that. Where might that have come from? Who did you feel like you were speaking to in that moment? What did this remind you of? And then intensity of inner child work for clients who have never done trauma processing. So if you've never dug into trauma, never talked about trauma, the client doesn't believe they have trauma, inner child work is a lot because you've never exposed yourself in that level of kind of intensity, I guess is one way to put it. So you want to kind of slow down or consider maybe other types of work before you dig into this, because it is really exposing a wound. And that doesn't always feel good. It usually doesn't. So you want to just consider what your client's needs are and where they are at. You really want to meet the client where they're at rather than trying to bring them to your perspective on the situation. And then one question that I really enjoy is, what's the point? Why are we talking about myself as a child? I don't want to. I'm coming in to talk about work. Why are we talking about my childhood experiences? Well, I've noticed there's a pattern here. You're talking about your issues with your boss. Your issues with your boss remind me of the issues you say you have with your parents. I'm wondering if there's a relation here. Like there seems to be a pattern. And that rapport piece. I understand that this maybe feels weird to talk about these childhood experiences. You came in to talk about some work-related struggles. But as your therapist, I'm noticing this pattern and I'm wondering if you're comfortable exploring some of these maybe alternative ways of looking at it. If not, that's okay. But I do see a path happening here. So maybe we can just touch on a little bit and see how you feel about it. I think there's a variety of ways to answer that question. But at the end of the day, it's really helping your client understand the purpose of this type of work and how this work may benefit them at the end of the day. So I wanted to ask if anyone has any other difficulties that they could see coming up with clients if they try to approach this work. I'll give everyone a couple minutes to think about it. Go ahead, Jamie.
I don't know if this is could be a difficulty, but is this something that you wouldn't use with like a teenager? Would you wait until someone is young adult or even past the age of 21 to do this work with them? And if not, how might that look different?
Yeah, so I have done this work with one teenager, and it was just inner child, like young child and child. And the reason we did that work with this client is because all of their childhood trauma that they had experienced up until that point was grounded in a specific time frame. So we explored this type of work with those two age groups. And this client was like a later teenager. So we weren't diving into those later pieces, but we did talk about how certain circumstances could come up as behaviors moving forward. So we did reparenting, but in the sense of you're not the parent, what would you have needed an adult to do? So some aspects of this, but not the whole picture, I would say.
Is it more difficult with teens then to have them identify their inner parent, especially if they're still living with their parents and having frequent experience with them? Okay.
Yeah, definitely. That's when I usually see a lot more of let's make an adult. Let's make a parental figure. Let's make a version of a mature person or thing, I guess is one way to put it, that you can utilize as the parent in this instance. That's actually what I did with that client. We did not use themselves. We did not use their parents for different reasons. We made up an adult, and I think the adult was actually an anime character, and it worked for that purpose. So, but yeah, I do think there is some difficulty because when you're working with a teenager, it really depends on perception at that time and comfort with going into that work. I usually 90% of the time I'm doing this work with somebody that's above 25 though.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Did anyone else have any other thoughts or considerations with this slide? Okay. Oh, go ahead, Chris.
I'll just throw out a common one as a common variable of any trauma-associated work. I would say a difficulty of this would be a client just has too high of emotional intensity, right? If we're going to dive into some really big challenging things, we need folks to be able to have a fairly self-regulated nervous system. We need somebody to have some coping skills. So I don't see that as much of a difficulty. But I think that if I was really drawn to this and acknowledged this is probably a direction we're going to go into, I do imagine that some of the prep work really does need to be kind of tied to grounding and feeling safe. And then this stuff becomes so much more approachable, which is fantastic. But I also can imagine working with some folks where this would be really difficult at first because they're just not in a headspace currently to be able to engage.
For sure. I 100% agree. I don't think this work is for everyone, and I don't think this work is for everyone at various stages in their therapeutic experience. I think that we need to consider one, where the client is at just in general. Do you have the emotional regulation techniques needed to do this? Do you have coping strategies, support systems, and all of these things outside of session? Do you have someone that can hold you accountable? Like there's a lot of pieces that I think need to be considered and at play to make sure the client's a good candidate for this and to make sure that the process is going in a way that isn't incidentally re-traumatizing. We're diving into this type of work and now all of a sudden I'm feeling more concerned, I'm feeling more anxious. Okay, let's dial back. Let's see what's coming up and where this is coming from. Do you feel overexposed? Do you trust me enough to be doing this work right now? So definitely really helpful considerations. And I do think grounding is important too. Like having the client know what grounding is, having the client know what mindfulness is, some breathing exercises, things of that sort, just to make sure they have a way to kind of reground themselves in where they are now. You are not still that child. We are talking about those childhood experiences, but you are not back there. So, okay. Any other thoughts, feelings, considerations, anything like that? Okay. One second. Okay. So that's the end of everything that I had for everybody here. As I mentioned, this was completely free. You do not have to donate. I do have options for donation at the bottom. Those are QR codes to scan if you'd like to donate. And then if the QR codes don't work, there is information from what to type into PayPal or Venmo to give a donation. I also added some resources, one being that book that I mentioned, Recovery of Your Inner Child. I think that's a really good workbook that would be good for people just wanting to dive into this and people that want to maybe explore this more with clients. There is a video. If you want the video, feel free to let me know. I can send it to you. It's a very short, like 4-minute video that's the super, super, super abridged version of everything I talked about today. And then there's some really helpful information by the Complex PTSD Foundation on the wounded inner child and how that can appear, what things might be helpful and things of that sort. And then if you're interested in asking more questions about this, talking more about this, sending referrals, whatever it may be. My contact email is below. Feel free to reach out. We can talk more about inner child work. I can give more information. I can give you access to this YouTube video if you'd like it. I'll let you know too that my next project will be on intergenerational trauma. I'll be doing another workshop in the future on that. So if anyone would like that information, feel free to reach out to me and I can put you on a list of people that I'll send the email to kind of at first. So does anyone have any questions, feedback, thoughts on just the whole experience for today? Go ahead, Holly.
Will you be sending us the this presentation today?
Yeah, I'll be sending an email with the entire PowerPoint in it.
Great, thank you. PowerPoint. That was the word I was looking
No
for.
worries. Go ahead, Jamie.
Just in general, this is very helpful. I appreciate all the specifics you gave us on questions that you can use with the clients. Also, the validating statements, even as I was reading those, I felt validated just reading them, so I can imagine how helpful it would be for a client. One question that I keep going back to is the question of when you think of yourself as a child, who do you picture? What age do you picture? I'm wondering what you would do with that question after a client answers that.
Yeah, so the first thing I do is typically ask, what are you doing in that scene in your head? What's going on? What's happening? And then we explore based around that. Next, I would ask, what circumstances do you remember from around that time? What was going on at that age? What sorts of things were happening? How were your parents? What was school like? So I kind of explore around that age because for a lot of individuals, the younger version of themselves that pops up does have prominent experiences or needs that need to be explored. So we kind of start there. For a lot of people, though, when I say picture yourself as a child, it is like the 7 to 10-ish range. Then I sometimes dig into, okay, picture yourself as a teenager. What did you look like? Which of them is louder? Which of them asks for more attention? Which of them needs more? So we can go in a variety of directions with that.
Is it important to stay on one inner child at a time rather than hopping back and forth between them?
For sure. That is a good question. I should have included that in the slide. So the way I typically do it with clients is it's kind of in a cycle. So we'll start at one particular age, the age that is requiring the most attention. We'll talk about those experiences. We'll process what comes up on the surface. And then we might talk about what's the ripple effect from these circumstances that you experienced. What behaviors came up and how did those behaviors move forward? So let's say we're talking about a child or a preteen. We might then jump to teenager. So let's see, how did this show up as a teenager? So you dealt with neglect, abuse, whatever it may be. The behaviors that came from that, how do you see them in your teenage experiences? And now we're talking about those inner teenage wounds. We're talking about those experiences and how they kind of evolved moving forward. And then sometimes a past experience will come back up. Well, wait a second. Now I'm remembering this happening as a child. I usually kind of put a flag into the situation. Okay, this is where we were last talking about with your teenager. We might touch on that childhood experience because it's relevant to the client in that moment. But I often see us going around in a circle. We'll go to young adult and then we're back to child again because something else comes up. And then we're going around and around and around. It also depends on where the client's at. Sometimes we're talking about the inner teenager for a long time, for example. And by long time, I mean there's several sessions just on a whole laundry list of experiences from being a teenager, which is fair. There's a lot that happens during that time frame. And then we go back to, well, wait, what happened when you were a child? Prior to getting bullied, what were your experiences like? So I think you can go in either direction. I just most often see that kind of circular pattern happening.
And then I have one more question.
No problem.
Is there anything that you found, like a worksheet or anything for yourself or clients to put all of this information down? I imagine it could get very complicated, confusing, and it would be helpful to have something to reference in later sessions.
For sure. I have most of my clients journal. I have not found a solid worksheet that I think really encapsulates the work we're doing, depending on what's coming up for the client. So we typically will do journaling prompts and we'll mark them off based on the session, and then we can reference back to it that way. I've also seen clients say, okay, this is the section for my inner child, this is the section for my inner teen, and they write those notes there. But it's typically journaling. I would love to either find or create a workbook of sorts or some sort of like medium to utilize for this, because I think keeping it organized is helpful because sometimes we can be processing one thing And then we're trying to figure out where else it applies. And now we're scrambling through pages trying to figure out what do I do with this information? It applies to so many spaces. So that is something I've thought about and I would love to do if I had the means to make something like that.
Let me know and send it over if you create it.
For sure, will do. Any other thoughts, questions, considerations? Go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, this was really helpful, and I took a bunch of notes and thoughts. One of the directions I thought of that I just wanted to affirm is this idea of like identity formation, right? Like how much of childhood and adolescence do we kind of come into the person that we might become? And how do those things develop? And working with a lot of young adults who are exploring gender and sexuality, I really appreciated one of the notes you made, which is like, when did you first realize, differences? When were you able to acknowledge, who you are as a person? And for me, a lot of that dives into maybe some of the emotions that are really tied to traumatic experiences and how some folks are really coming into themselves at different points of time. And so our inner child, our inner teen might be responding to things based on bullying, based on shame associated with gender and sexuality. So as young adults, we're kind of seeing the after effects. We're seeing those shame reactions kick in. And so I thought it was really interesting, just kind of borrowing it from different aspects. This feels trauma related, and I'd love to do identity formation. And this was spot on for that as well. So just wanted to expand the narrative a little bit.
Thank you. One thing I'd like to note too, just in relation to that, is I think inner child work can definitely lead back to authenticity work. Authenticity work is something that's important to me too as part of trauma work. But I think when we start to recognize how traumatic experiences and circumstances and narratives change and warp the way we think it is safe to proceed moving forward, we can then dial back and say, well, wait a second, who would we be without these experiences? What would be different about myself if this hadn't happened, this hadn't happened, this hadn't happened? And if we can allow ourselves to explore that more like thoroughly, or at least apply a level of safety over exploration in that way, it can make it easier to come back to ourselves and say, oh, this is who I am. This is who I would have been without this. Let me make the moves to become more of this in the present moment. Okay. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'll re-ask any thoughts, any considerations, anything else anyone wanted to mention. Go ahead, Holly.
Thank you so much. This was really good.
Thank you.
I've heard like inner child stuff, just like bits and pieces here and there, but have a training on it was really helpful. And it very much ties into how I do my work. So connected very well there. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. No problem at all. Like I said, I'll be doing one more on intergenerational trauma, which I'll just briefly describe because I like to describe it. So it's the relationship between generations and your life's trauma. So your grandmother's trauma, how that created trauma in your mother, who then created trauma within you. So something also very important to me, I think it ties in very well with inner child work, because a lot of times the way we were parented or the experiences we had were based around the experience our parents had, the experience our grandparents had, and so on and so forth. But if there's no other questions, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. This was actually my first workshop that I've done on my own outside of a practice. So it was a little nerve-wracking, but I feel proud of myself at the end of the day. It was really nice to have all of you here, and I appreciate your time. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out, and I will be emailing all of you the PowerPoint, and feel free to ask any additional questions if you have them, okay?
Great job, Sierra.
Nice job, Sierra.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sierra.
No problem. Bye.
Bye.